First of all, welcome to today's Green Roads webinar, the 25th in the series. I'm Ian Greenwood, if you haven't seen me around. I'm a consultant with the ADB and been working a lot with Michael Inyala and the team in the Green Roads space. And I'll be your moderator here today. For the special 25th occasion, we have Gordon Keller, one of the developers of the Green Roads Toolkit, to share his experience with you and all of us. Just looking forward, our next actual webinar is going to be on the 8th of May, and that's covering the topics of improving mobility for livable cities. So watch out for your invite for that one in your mailbox. Now for today's session by Gordon, covering the topic of biodiversity and roads. Gordon probably doesn't actually need an introduction. I think he's spoken to us, certainly is active online, but because he's stayed up well past his bedtime in his home in California, it's only right to give him the honours of a proper introduction. So Gordon is a licensed civil and geotechnical engineer based in California, and he has degrees from UCLA and Berkeley. Worked with the US Forest Service for 40 years, currently a private consultant. Experience pretty much, he's done it all. Low volume roads, slope stability, retaining structures, drainage, material source, bridges, dams, environmental mitigations, wildlife crossings, climate change, climate resilience, you name it, he's done it. He's worked for agencies such as the World Bank, the IADB, USAID, Indian Institute of Technology, and of others, plus of course the ADB, including his work on the Green Roads Toolkit over the past few years. Involved in numerous boards like the TRB, American Society of Civil Engineers and others, IRF to name a few. Of course, with that much experience and knowledge, he's extensively published in a range of subjects. I should have just summarised and said he really has done it all. He's also a hell of a nice guy, so it's a pleasure to be able to moderate for him. As a standard practice, please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Gordon, I pass the floor to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Ian, most kind of you. You know, having been around a while, that just means you've gotten gray hairs over the years. I have. Okay, am I in full screen mode? Can you see my screen
let
here?
You know
okay.
when it's just loading through at my end, but I'll let you know when it says it's yep, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? That's kind of a sound check here. Make sure it's okay.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. Now the only problem I have at this end is that it's not advancing on me right now. Technical difficulties. I do want to, you know, you may wonder why, as a civil engineer, I'm talking about biodiversity, and I've worked a lot on the road side of biodiversity, but I've just had the pleasure of working with a lot of great people in a lot of different countries, and whose names are listed there at the bottom of this first page. Some of the people that I've borrowed information from in putting to this presentation together. So I want to acknowledge thanks to all of them for this information. And I'm curious because, like I say, it's not so okay. It is advancing here. Okay, this is part of this you know, Green Roads Toolkit that we've been involved with for a couple of years now, seems like. And you know, it involves 9 different areas here. We're looking at decarbonization, climate resilience, water and land management, reducing pollution, improving quality of life, disaster preparedness, material sustainability, fostering inclusive growth, and part of that is preserving biodiversity. It's been a real interesting, fun project working on this with the ADB here. And the interesting thing about biodiversity is it covers a number of different areas, certainly hydrology and how we deal with water, climate change, and how changes in climate affect wildlife and vegetation, and direct how biodiversity, how roadkill and problems with fragmentation of habitat. So a number of these different themes all have relevance with biodiversity. And the problem with roads, there are just a lot of roads out there. That's a fundamental problem. There's 8 million kilometers of new roads that are anticipated in between 20 and 30 in Asia and the Pacific. World Bank forecasts another 25 million kilometers of new roads by the year 2050. So, just major number of roads, which therefore have major impacts. And that's why thinking from an engineering standpoint, we need the roads, but we also need to have mitigations and ways to minimize the negative impacts on biodiversity. Some of the negative impacts or impacts that we run into, and the ones I'll be covering at least in some degree here, is number of animals that are killed annually, millions, fragmentation and loss of habitat, damage to upstream aquatic habitat, loss of wetlands, introduction and movement of invasive species, water quality degradation, and access to sensitive areas, and modification of vegetation. All these things are impacts. Some of them can be positive, many of them are negative when it comes to dealing with roads. And so the first, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on wildlife crossings, protecting and preserving vertebrates and invertebrates, or roadkill problems. And this is particularly because I think it's one of the areas where it's most obvious the impacts of roads. So the impacts we run into is that there's something like 1 million vertebrates killed. I used to think it was annually, but I've heard that it's actually daily if you count many of the small little species worldwide that are killed. Billion. Billions of dollars in annual collision damage, particularly certainly speaking for here in California or in the Western United States. And people get killed. Hundreds of people are killed every year. And I don't think any species are immune from this. Oh, you've probably all seen, pictures of wildlife mortality. Poor a big feline there. Poor little Joey there on the bottom left, who's a wombat there in the middle, armadillos. No species are spared when it comes to killing animals. The trouble with things like armadillos, their defense is to jump up and curl up in a ball, and it doesn't work too well with against automobiles. Interestingly enough, wildlife, birds are one of the biggest. There's something like 3 times as many birds killed as other mammals by cars, and particularly I think they see roadkill, so they swoop down on the road, then they get killed themselves. But it's birds, pets like that dog there, reptiles. Everybody, like I say, nobody is immune from roadkills. Including humans. These are some pictures that were, I think, it didn't fare well for the driver or the passenger, these vehicles. That lower right photo there, that big dent in the hood. I do have a dent in the hood of my car. It's not quite as bad as that one, but it is from a deer that grazed me one time. And, they come out of nowhere, and it's, you don't have a lot of time to avoid them. So it's a major problem. What we do about it, there's the all standards of roads are problems. Your really high standard roads, a lot of expressways, they often have fencing, so they're not as bad. The low standard roads, unsealed roads, people are typically not driving as fast. Maybe if you're under 60, 70 kilometers per hour, you have time to react more when you see animals. But probably the worst actors are your 2-lane paved roads, because you're driving fast. You don't have the defenses. You don't have fencing to keep the animals off the road frequently. So my impression is they are probably the most serious when it comes to roadkill. A lot of things we can do, overpasses and underpasses. There's just huge studies, huge amounts of money have gone into these varieties of underpasses and overpasses. And I'll talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of each one. One of the main challenges is deciding where you're going to put in these, particularly overpasses. It gets a bridge, and they're therefore quite expensive. This is a set of photos I borrowed from Tony Clevenger that on a project we were working on there with ADB in Nepal. And some of the things you look at, the studies to decide where you're going to put the structures. You want to do roadkill surveys. Know where your hotspots and problems are. You camera traps. You look at the sort of footprints or any sort of traps or tracks you can see of it, wildlife. And so by looking at that, you can identify some of these hot spots or areas that are the most problematic. And that one photo here in the middle there, I think that was of the Barindabar corridor, a wildlife corridor that was of high importance. So it was in the Terai region of Nepal. Now these are a couple of photos from this Ascendi, a group in Portugal, where they're looking at some similar studies of some of the monitoring, uh, you know, trying to identify where, how much roadkill there was, hot spots, in other words, areas where there's a lot of mortality, what sort of mitigation measures might be used. And so they were identifying, and part of this as Cindy program was training, data collection. They do something with the carcasses, and then using like apps, basically these roadkill observation systems, which is people call it kind of citizen science. You're looking at, you know, counting on using people and apps to report where they and georeferencing where there's a wildlife killed on the road, and just so you know where are the real problems, the hot spots, and where you should consider putting in some crossings. This is a photo borrowed from some people I've worked with in Pantera group in Costa Rica. And the nice thing about camera traps is you can really see, what sort of species are using the crossings or culverts or bridges. The amount of them, where there's the most activity, and where the highest priority areas for to be doing some sort of mitigations, perhaps improving a culvert or adding another culvert, something like that. But these camera traps are quite, there's some great little footage on how people are dealing with and looking at what species are using what types of culverts or things. The highest range is, these are some photos, a couple of them at least are from Malaysia, out of Kuala Lumpur. I looked at this project when it was still under when it was still under construction. Extremely expensive, but it's something that is also probably the best mitigation you can use if you're having to cross a very sensitive area, perhaps like a national park. And so these are areas that you're going to invest a lot of money to really protect the wildlife. And if you can stay above them on a viaduct or flyover, that's the most expensive, but the best solution. I hope everything's seeing okay. Every once in a while I see something say connections unstable here in the outback of America. So hopefully it's coming through okay.
It's all good, thank you.
Oh, good. So far, so good. Sometimes adaptation. This photo on the right was from Europe. The photos on the left were from the project we're working with in Taiwan, where taking an old bridge over a highway that and it's not being used too much, and putting some vegetation along the edge and making it as something suitable where at least all wildlife would be using it as a wildlife crossing. Not as good as a full, just dedicated wildlife crossing, something like these, where it's specifically for wildlife. You're putting in vegetation that's representative of the area so that wildlife will tend to use it. A colleague of mine there working for World Bank, Juan Quintero, did a lot of work in China. And so if you have a tunnel, and hey, if you can have the natural vegetation that's above a tunnel, that's the best wildlife crossing. It's obviously not redesigned for a wildlife crossing, but it serves it well if you're in that circumstance. Aerial crossings, arboreal crossings, are something that very common in many tropical areas, and both apparently from bird standpoint to be high on a canopy, and certainly for monkeys, for primates. Matter of fact, this is a photo from my colleague in Pantera there in Costa Rica, and quite successful with a lot of their different designs. And although different designs for different species, some of them prefer a wider fence, some of them prefer just almost a rope. The bottom guy there on the right, bottom, I think he wanted to just make sure he'd washed his face there. He was curious about the camera. Other unique crossings, you see these photos on the left here were for crab crossings from Australia. Apparently certain season where there's just mass migration of crabs near a coastal area. The center one was putting netting against butterflies in this one migratory area. And the right photos are sort of things you can do like for serpents or snakes or salamanders, something where the tunnels, but complete with fencing to guide the animals. This is an example of just Lake Jackson in Florida, where a culvert was put across. It was, fragmentation of the habitat. A lot of roadkill, unfortunately, turtles. So they ended up putting in this fencing that's shown here in white through a culvert and just guiding the turtles through the culvert so they would not cross the highway. Bats, they're kind of a special problem. My bridge friends, bridge engineers, don't particularly like bats in their bridges because then they can't maintain them properly. But bats turn out, or bridges turn out to be great bat habitat office, and or cliff swallows, for instance, other birds. And so some of the things you can do is if you're maintaining or cleaning the bridges, maybe not do it during a season when they're having the babies, something like that. But it's a bit of a challenge between the wildlife and the bridge engineers in this department. Finches and de-icing salt just getting killed on the road. Maybe they could be using rather than some sort of salt, some chemical that wouldn't attract the birds if you have this type of problem. So a lot of these problems are quite unique. Fencing something is, when you talk about a wildlife crossing, you've got to direct the animals to those crossings. And so you need fencing. In major highways, often there's continuous fencing, in which case you have these jump outs shown on the bottom here of how to get the animals off the highway. The other fencing is just custom made depending on the type of the species of animals. And, it's often not continuous, but it's far enough to make sure at least direct the animals through the wildlife crossing or the overpass or the underpass, because otherwise they'll just cross the highway any place they can. They didn't read the guide. Oh, and I love all these different types of wildlife crossing, photos to identify animals on the road. You can, the top right one there from Transylvania, from my colleague Juan Quintero. I don't know how often, whether that's bats or vampires crossing, but the lower one there with the kangaroo, you can tell where that comes from. Many other types. The one in the top left here was from a leopard cat in Taiwan, probably the cutest wildlife crossing sign I've seen. Others are from national park areas. The one in the middle there, I'm not sure whether that was trying to tell you there was a real crooked road or actually it was a snake on the road, but either way, it's probably a serpentine road. But what's the problem with signs? People don't pay attention to them. People don't slow down enough a lot of times. So often things like vibrators or what we call traffic calming devices are quite effective to they should slow down. You folks down there in New Zealand have these things, this odd thing called judder bars. I don't know about never heard that term anyplace else, but that was from there. I think someplace there in New Zealand. Let me talk a little bit about drainage features. Drainage structures, whether they be bridges, drifts, culverts, ditches, they can typically really impact or impede wildlife movement, or they can really help wildlife movement. So we really need to design our drainage structures so they help promote wildlife movement. One of the things why that's so important, where there's a lot of fragmentation and changes of habitat. These are some photos in some three different countries. The place where there's some green happens to be along streams in the riparian corridor, and that's where animals want to move. So those are some of the areas that are key to make sure we put in bridges or some sort of crossing structure that the animals can move on, because you can see the rest of the terrain is often already is maybe cattle grazing or something like that. So these riparian corridors are where you put the drainage structures are really critical for wildlife movement. Bridges are probably the ideal structure. The nice thing about bridges is often you need one anyway, or there is one there already. So you go ahead and use the bridge. Sometimes you can adapt the bridge, but if it's a big open structure that is wide or dry part of the time, that's ideal for wildlife movement. They tend, wildlife likes to move in that riparian corridor along the streams. There's a couple of photos region there of Nepal. The upper left photo, it's not ideal just because it's old and the openings are small. The lower structure picture there is much more adaptable and better for suitable for movement of wildlife. And the photo there on the right was a small culvert that's being upgraded to a larger size box culvert to particularly for wildlife movement next to the Chitwan National Park there in Nepal. So, you know, bridges are not all bridges are great. The one on the right is good because very open. The one on the left just doesn't have a migration corridor as well because it's a kind of a V-shaped channel. Something that can be done and often done is building in benches so that wildlife can move along that corridor and then go right under the bridge on a bench. And particularly if you have riprap or some sort of scour protection at the bridge site, which is hard to cross, if you can put a trail across it like these left-hand photos, then that's ideal to help promote wildlife movement. And so you've got a lot of varieties of structures. I like box culverts for movement of wildlife, particularly because they have a flat bottom. A lot of creatures don't like going through the water. So you on these right-hand photos, right upper and lower are benches that are built into culverts to help promote wildlife movement. You do restrict a little bit of the capacity, the hydraulic capacity of the culvert, so that's can be an issue. There are maintenance problems at times, but they can certainly help facilitate wildlife movement. Also, if you have concrete bottoms it accelerates the velocity, so you get this little drop at the bottom from scour, and that can be a barrier to fish or to other wildlife sort of movement. And so I prefer structures that have a natural stream bottom, which implies you have rather than some sort of a concrete base in your box culverts. Now, this guy here, you know, you may be talking about culverts for wildlife movement. This guy, boy, looks like maybe he set up home in there. You know, he looks pretty like he's just coming out, and who's disturbing his house there? So the problem is we need to think in the long term. It's you know, as we have more and more development from a variety of infrastructure and just roads, that wildlife gets their habitat and their you know it gets tougher and tougher on them. The other thing very closely related to all this is habitat fragmentation. And that's actually ultimately more serious probably than roadkill or wildlife mortality because you know it hurts in the it's a long-term problem, and you start getting into very fragmented habitats, and animals can't move, so you start having genetic problems with you know you lose your healthy population of animals. It's kind of like you know, if you're a farmer and you have a certain amount of property, you can make it. If you go down to only half that size of crops, you may be able to make it. You may not be financially viable. And so for animals, it's just a question of whether they have enough range or not. The options, you know, if you can forget about it, just go right through the habitat, clear fragmentation. The ideal is to go around the critical habitat and avoid fragmentation altogether. That's probably the best solution. You can put in wildlife crossings, which is what we just talked about a lot as a mitigation to minimize fragmentation and provide some connectivity. You can do things like some habitat compensation, which is tough. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not work. It's not the best solution. And like I say, probably the most common issue is putting in some types of wildlife crossings, as we were just showing. Here's just examples of fragmentation. You know, it can be huge in a lot of areas. And so, you know, if there's a flyway there or you have an elevated structure, then animals can go underneath it. If not, then they have to cross these major highways, which is that it really blocks movement. That's what they call fragmentation. Also, a lot of time, there's a lot of just land use changes, like the photo on the left here. You know, agriculture, a lot of your natural vegetation is gone, so it's harder for an animal to just find the cover it wants to for movement. Or even on a macro scale, this right-hand photo here is in Taiwan, problems with movement between like frogs and crabs in a coastal area where you hit a retaining wall, which I don't think much about because I love retaining walls, but it's a barrier for wildlife movement. And this is an example. It was in Lake Petanitza in Central America, in Guatemala, where they put this causeway across the part of the lake. And not only it stopped any movement, there's just a small culvert in that upper left photo. And so the part of the lake was dying because of lack of just putrefaction and no interchange of oxygen and no current movement. And so eventually it got to be enough of a problem because this is key tourist area on the way to to Tikal, a major Mesoamerican archaeological site. And so they installed a big bridge, as you see here on the right photo, as to keep that part of the lake from dying, which to support the biodiversity in that lake. So that's all mostly with wildlife. Now I want to talk a little bit about aquatic issues, which is another huge issue, certainly in the Western United States or all of the United States, and probably in any parts of the world where you count on certainly Northern Europe, where you count on wildlife in the streams. And what happens if you have a culvert because it accelerates flow, you get this drop off or a scour pool, and therefore you have a barrier. So fish cannot get upstream beyond that point. So you're losing all the habitat that's upstream of this road crossing. And so it's become a major issue. And I like to fish. I love salmon, and so it's a significant issue that needs to be done or dealt with. Also, small culverts can serve as barriers. And so the different problems with culverts and fish passage or aquatic organism passage is if it's too fast, the fish can't go through. If it's too shallow, if there's no resting pool, and if it's too high. Those are all things that constitute barriers to movement of fish in the streams. As a mitigation, we've done things. We've tried to put in these fish baffles and fish ladders. They kind of work and kind of don't work. They require a lot of maintenance. They're not a great solution, but it's something we have tried. The best solution, oh, okay, well, there's, you can have better genetic fish, who can just cross without, so culverts, we don't need no stinking culverts. However, since it's hard to get that type of fish around, so that's not a very good solution either. So the best solution is what we call the stream simulation solution, or AOP. It's aquatic organism passage. And the key there is putting in structures that have a natural stream channel bottom. And so that promotes, just fish and all aquatic organism species movement. They can be in big round culverts that are buried a little bit deeper underground. Or they can be box culverts. They can be culverts with, spread footings. If it's a box, it just needs to be buried deep enough that it grades back in to create a natural stream channel bottom. So it kind of looks like this. And there's three big advantages to this. One is, it's ideal for fish and aquatic movement. If there's not flow full time all the time, it's still good for wildlife movement. If part of the, if the bed or stream bed there is dry part of the time. And from a climate resilience standpoint, I love these because they're fairly large structures that have a capacity of maybe 100-year flood, and so they're quite resilient against climate change issues of major floods. They do cost more initially, but since they lower risk, and if you look at their design life of 25 or 50 years, they can be very cost effective. Fords have that same sort of problem if they're small vents, which is very common, like this Irish Fords, I think they're sometimes called. They plug up easily. They're barriers to movement, and so these bigger structures, which are more expensive but much better certainly for aquatic organism passage and fish passage. So there's some great references on this. The stream simulation, a Forest Service publication, and this other one here from Pennsylvania Center for Dirt and Gravel Roads. And these are kind of the two Bibles, I think, that deal with designing to this stream simulation type design concept. Okay, another major issue problem with roads and biodiversity is movement of invasive species. I think we've all seen this problem in many, many countries. Here, this photo, kind of a type of kudzo there in Brazil. Some vines taking over these trees, both in New Zealand on the bottom here and in the Pacific Islands. This happened to be in Coast Rye. And here in California, our lovely little star thistle or Scotch broom, which are just they're just nasty. I was telling you, and they were that star thistle right in the middle photo there was introduced because it produces great honey. Well, I'm glad the honey's good, but it's also wrecked millions of acres or hectares of ground in California and the West because cattle eat it. It's pretty hard on their stomachs. So, just invasive species are a major problem. And transportation is a big part of the problem because we move the seeds in part of the plant, so like particularly in tires of vehicles. So, the size of the problem they say is, billions and hundred billions of dollars per year. And that counts, of course, agriculture and the whole range of problems with invasive species, whether plants or animals or microbes. Hearing some of the problems is, with the construction, as the side of roads that we clear, doing maintenance along roads where we move seeds, and if there's invasive species there, it gets moved down the road. So there's a lot of activities to minimize that problem, a lot of maintenance activities with mowing and making sure that we're not using some seeds that have invasive species in them. Um, you move the construction sites off of spoil sites or for borrow sites to make sure there aren't invasive plants there. Excuse the Spanish there. I can cover that over very well. And or washing equipment. There's a number of things we can do to minimize the problem of invasive species. And washing construction equipment, a lot of times we require that in construction contracts. If you're moving or on a firefighting project, forest fires, if they're moving from one project to another site, we require that they wash the equipment so they don't carry the seeds from one site to another. There's this thing called integrated vegetable management, roadside vegetable management. And so there's, things you can do. It's prescribed burns, biocontrols, chemicals, sporadic spraying with some herbicides, well-tuned or well-timed mowing. Goats are great except they're hard to get. Sometimes they can be expensive and hard to come by. Planting native grasses, hand cutting, pulling up, the invasive species. So there's things we can do, but it's tough. I think it's a problem worldwide. There's good information and literature out there. Part of the ballot challenge is to know what are the invasive species, so you know what to look at. A lot of time it looks like a pretty flower, but it's a nasty, pretty flower. And so it's something we just need to work at. Other aspects of biodiversity dealing with the roadside flora is, roadside vegetation. Sometimes it can be great. Sometimes it can be counterproductive. Traffic safety is also always a key issue. So you want to have, clear zones. And depending on what vegetation is in there, it may help keep animals away from there, or it may attract animals, which can be counterproductive and lead to more roadkill. So the selection of plants that we use along the roadside is important. And native vegetation is usually always the best native, but trimming it in some way that we satisfy road safety as well as trying to maintain the native vegetation. One of the things we can do also, like on road projects, there are 3 different projects in 3 different countries. We can take the native vegetation from a construction zone, put it into a nursery, save it there, take care of it, then go back and use it for replanting in the disturbed areas and roadsides and borrow areas and staging areas. So nurseries can be a key area, a way to make sure we choose correct plants or at least native plants for road projects. And in a lot of our, bioengineering or some of the slope treatments and erosion control, we just have to be careful to choose species that are adapted to the local area. The bamboo is here on the right in China, is just a native. Kenya, India was a native species in this one zone in Central America where we're doing a project. So we can really help with vegetation and maintaining native species if we're selective about what species we use. Wetlands, water quality protection, the last area I want to spend a little bit of time on here. Wetlands, wetlands are extremely valuable from a biodiversity standpoint. There's something like in coastal wetlands, seems like about half the endangered species live in wetlands, coming from like alligators, crocodiles, some wildlife, birds species, and also a lot of food that we eat comes out of wetland areas, mollusks and things. And so, and then we fill them in sometimes with roads, and it's something I think the hierarchy, I would say, for practice dealing with wetlands is first out of them, avoid wetlands because they're very valuable, you know, from biodiversity. Second, there are strong programs when you have to go through a wetlands of wetland compensation, trying to find wetlands someplace else or establishing wetlands someplace else and preserving that. And third would be some sort of mitigation for crossing the wetland, which is what's kind of shown in these photos here. And these are from the Western United States, where we have crossed meadows, which we probably should not have, but we did. And so we put in these banks of either coarse rock or banks of culverts so at least you're maintaining the flow and not drying up, not damaging the wetland. You're still creating a little bit of a barrier, but at least you're not causing a major impact. Some of the other things in temporary crossings or for low volume road crossings is using sawdust or landing mats or geocells or wood pallets, things sometimes they can be removed if it's just a temporary road crossing of a wetland area. The center photo there's a geosynthetic down, then pushing out a platform of sawdust, or it could be gravel for a temporary road. But basically, good thing to do with wetlands is stay off of them. And okay, the last area here I want to just spend a little time on is water quality degradation from roads. And the problem with water is it's something we all need. It's we don't live with water, same thing for wildlife. So clean water is pretty important for wildlife as well as it is for us as human beings. And these are all just examples of let's see, that upper left photo was from Vanuatu. The lower ones are from different countries, mostly in Latin America, I think, of just unsealed roads or closed roads or primary access roads that were not properly erosion controlled. And so they've all contributed to a lot of movement of sediment. And then off the road, it was looked that way. In the streams downstream, it looks like this, rather than clear water, you've got muddy water. Not a good situation, it's just a real waste. And they say, it's a lot cheaper to prevent water quality degradation or water from getting muddy than it is to have to purify water. So once you've got water that's contaminated like this, it's expensive to clean up. This was a kind of a classic example of both these photos are just islands of sediment that have come off of some unsealed roads and some highly erosive soils in Latin America. And once you've got this much sediment into the streams, you're really damaging the aquatic stream there. Maybe good for some of the vegetation, but it's pretty tough on any fish or crayfish or any of the aquatic species. And you're just losing good water quality. So these are some of the negatives that happen from roads. And I don't want to be totally negative about roads. There's useful runoff from water and onto ponds and things. Meta Meta, one of the real program they've been very heavily involved with is roads for water, and it's taking, particularly in the arid sort of countries, it's taking that runoff from a road and putting it into, say, a sediment pond or a wildlife, area where you can wildlife or cattle can use the water rather than just running it off and wasting it. Or it can go out into bioswales that can help support local native vegetation or crops. And so how we manage water can be a very positive thing as well as just trying to solve the problem, thinking about purely the road. This photo on the right is a borrow site, which is, sometimes we can backfill them, sometimes they can be problems, but they also can be a great place for flyover for wildlife, for birds, particularly, or nesting areas for geese or something like that, or a variety of species where you have water ponded where in an area where otherwise there aren't, it's basically a little lake. And so it can be very useful for wildlife. Um, some of the things we shouldn't do, washing equipment in water. It seems like it's a common problem, unfortunately, but washing construction equipment, washing your motorcycles and bicycles, it's a favored pastime in a lot of different countries, but it sure is hard on water quality. And I just hate the taste of gasoline myself, and drinking water. And so it's just something that it shouldn't be done. Everybody loves water. I think let's see this upper left photo. This is actually in Ecuador, I think it was. This lower right photos in the Sudan, and a lot of activities in the water, and a lot of that's fine. But those cars shouldn't be there in either case. Picnic, yes. Washing clothes, no. Washing your car, no. And so, because we're every time you're doing that, you're typically getting oil and gasoline contaminants into water. So it's just water deserves better respect than that. Another problem with resource extraction is gravel operations or quarry operations in rivers. And, it's pretty common in many countries. These photos, the left ones were in Nepal, the right ones are in China. I guess the bottom central ones in South America. And in each case, certainly in China, I had the impression that concrete was much more valuable than water quality in streams. A lot of impact to a lot of streams. Um, this was 10 years ago. Hopefully, it's not still going on now. But this if you're extracting gravel directly out of the streams, you're causing some problems with just the sediment balance in the stream. But typically, you're also kicking up a lot of sediment and degrading water quality, killing a lot of invertebrates that live in the water, a lot of fish. There are alternatives. This is a couple pictures of ways to stay out of the water but still take advantage of the gravel. Do some mapping. This was an old river terrace, the upper left-hand photo, where they're extracting gravel, but the river is off to the right, and this is an old, kind of left high and dry river terrace gravel, and so that's a place you can still get the gravel, quality gravel, but not working in the stream. Same thing down here in the right-hand photo where they're taking gravel out of the river, but at least they're not operating right in the creek. They're extracting it and then working back in the riverbanks rather than actually in the active river channel. So it's just something that, like I say, I consider water quality protection really a very highly important, both for us as humans and for biodiversity and for wildlife and for the environment. So as engineers, we need to not do this sort of thing or mitigate it in some way as shown here. Um, say a problem, this was a problem I saw in a lot of Pacific islands, is where people like ring roads, they like to put a road right along the coast. And yeah, it's a nice view, nice access to the beaches. But if you have lagoons, and in this case, there are examples of where you've basically isolated the fresh water from the salt water, so you're not getting a mix of brackish water, and that brackish water is what like mangroves particularly really depend on, which is a lot of crab species, a lot of wildlife depends on the root systems in these mangroves, and if you don't have this brackish water, then the interchange of fresh water and salt water, you kill that mangrove swamps, and so these coastal ring roads can be quite damaging, and so they need to either have some bridges or aqueduct or some sort of viaducts to bridge across these areas if you're crossing a lagoon area, or maybe go inland for a little ways there, but don't block off these lagoons. And the consequence also in just coastal areas of a lot of sediment is you're killing a certain amount of crab or some of the coastal species of wildlife. So, in summary here, we have a couple of choices here, depending on how we manage our roads and dealing with water particularly is we can either have clean water or we can have dirty water. And a lot comes back to just how we manage our roads, how we do our erosion control protection, how we manage stormwater runoff. And that's where, to me, engineering best practices are important to help maintain fresh water. I was tempted to put in a bunch of slides here going into engineering best practices. I said, no, 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 no. This is we're talking about diversity, but basically to maximize the roads because we need the roads, but to minimize those impacts on biodiversity, I think you want to do three things. One, okay, one you want to do some environmental analysis, understand what the impacts might be and what sort of species of either wildlife or vegetation is going to be impacted by some road construction or some project? Are you going to be creating fragmentation? And then you can, after you've done that analysis, you can do some sort of compensation. Second, I feel like application of just BMP's best management or best engineering practices goes a long ways to certainly for water quality protection, but also as the opportunity to identify problems and incorporate engineering designs, wildlife crossings, things like that, or culverts or stream simulation designs to prevent the problems. And third is, engineers, we're good at creative solutions. If we've had certain species working with biologists or botanists, we can come up with sort of solutions of sort of tunnels or wildlife crossings that are suitable, that that kind of help a certain species to maintain their movement, or it can help to engineer solutions for larger culvert designs, or it can help engineer like bioengineering solutions to come up with erosion control and slope stabilization, but using some sort of native species vegetation would cause the least problems. So there's a lot we can do. It takes analysis, it takes application of BMPs and good and creative work. So there's a lot of also great references out there, and general biodiversity and ecology are this handbook of road ecology. This is a second version that's out, and this publication Crossings, which is really quite insightful, talking about how ecology is modified and damaged and changed by roads. There's a lot of good information on wildlife crossings, like this structural handbook by Federal Highways that Tony Clevenger was involved with. There's this roadside tree planting that's a publication by Meta. The stream simulation, I already showed that publication, and the lower right photo is a publication put out by Asian Development Bank for green roads and how to deal with a lot of the unique species in Asia for wildlife crossings. So there's a wealth of information out there. It's just a question of kind of digging into it. I have copies of PDFs of many of these things. I can't, the crossings you have to buy and the handbook on road ecology, but if anybody wants information on where to find these, I'd be glad to send it to you. And last, just putting a plug again for this Green Roads Toolkit project. It's the community of practice. There's a lot of good ideas out there. So far, I think we've tried to identify about 150 different practices that in all these different 9 themes. But all you folks out there have a lot of great ideas. So please, think about some of the things you can do with your roads that either help the environment or help social situations or reduce, the greenhouse gases. And so share those ideas and get them into Ian or Michael there, and just take advantage of knowledge to contribute to this community of practices. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attention, and been a pleasure putting this information together. So thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. You can stop sharing your screen there and keep your camera on, and we'll have a little quick discussion. We've got some questions there we'll go through. Picking up your comment about nurseries and growing the seeds from the local area. I know a number of places that's a really good way to get the community involved. You can collect the seeds, get a community group, get a school or similar to grow the seedlings. You pay them some money, and then they have a vested interest and then seeing it through. So it's a nice way to bring the community along with you on a big road project.
Yeah, actually,
we'll go through these.
Well, I was just going to say 2 out of those 3 photos I showed were community nurseries that were part of road projects, and the people with their hard hats on the 3rd photo were agency.
So we've got a number of questions here, so we'll go for we'll go for the short answers each time. Um, from Simon, wildlife crossings provide separation and safety. They may still be noisy. Does this put off some animals from crossing? Is it a relevant issue? And is there any way to reduce traffic noise?
Yeah, no, that's certain animal species certainly are susceptible animal noise. I've heard people changing like the surfacing rather than sort of a micro texture on the road surfacing rather than a chip seal, for instance, that's a little coarser. So things that cut down on road noise, and maybe you can put up signs saying, don't be using the Jake's brakes on trucks, things like that. But highways are somewhat noisy, so it's hard to totally mitigate that, and that is a problem. Also, lighting, it can be a problem, and it just keeps some animals away. It confuses birds, for instance, also.
Uh, we'll flick on through Simon's next one there. Is there a danger that the stream simulation culverts are difficult to maintain at the appropriate level of fill and therefore liable to block or scour back to the structure?
Well, it's the fact that they're bigger, they actually typically require less maintenance than smaller structures. They're less likely to plug. They're less likely to have scour problems in washing out in floods. And we've got some pretty good performance from some major hurricanes that have hit in different parts of the United States, where the stream simulation designs have performed relatively well compared to hundreds of other smaller old culverts that have failed. But they are more
I guess is conceptually, even if you did the stream simulation one at a smaller scale, you could still have your box culvert sitting slightly higher and to the side as well, can't you? The additional flow, there's additional capacity out to the side, but your regular water flow is in this very much your natural stream setup.
Yeah, it'd be like an overflow type structure. Yeah.
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 Gopal, comment there. Should we be including biodiversity protection and special suggestions in our feasibility studies? Do you agree? I think yes.
Well, it depends on where, I consider part of environmental analysis. It's, yeah, it depends on where the feasibility study comes in, but I think it certainly needs to be considered. Yeah, both from a road standpoint and the human standpoint, as well as a biodiversity standpoint, and the cost of the project.
Yeah. I recall a project in New Zealand here where they went out and collected something like 1,000 lizards, I think, from the site and protected them during construction, then brought them back on site afterwards. So, if you can take it, these are the little geckos, not your big ones.
Yeah.
David's got a question about the materials. David, all the materials go online, and I'm sure Mark or Chris or someone will put a link up where you can see that. So all our webinars are recorded, and the PowerPoint and everything goes up online. And if you reach out, Gordon's details are there at the end of his slide deck. You're welcome to contact me or anyone else.
Yeah, please feel free to contact me and my website there if you want any other information also on that. So yeah, thank you. Or contact Ian. Yeah.
And I'll pass you on to Gordon. From Kieran, some of the solutions using different materials and wetlands are interesting. However, maintenance of those roads would be challenging. What are some good practices to manage such roads and wetlands, especially when materials like wooden pallets, sawdust, etc.? I would take it we're really talking about, the short-term type roads, aren't we? Or the very, very low volume, very low usage.
Right. Otherwise, probably viaducts or causeways are probably the best way to cross a wetland, because you can fill across it, but then you're destroying the wetland.
Well, it's also, of course, typically the wetlands have quite a deep amount of silt and mud, so to actually construct a road on it is extremely challenging in its own right. So I think, apart from temporary ones going in for a short-term basis, I don't think there's not a lot to be gained from any point of view of going into the wetland. So
Unfortunately, I think a lot of wetlands are filled in for probably more for agriculture than for road projects. But you're right, they're a geotechnical nightmare, because of the foundation problems, and they are often quite deep, and it can be designed around, but it's expensive.
yeah, and it's interesting. Even with, you've got the same in America that we've done a lot of studies here in New Zealand looking at the cleaning of the water from runoff from roads. And you can spend a lot of money on fancy engineered solutions, but keeping the right sort of reeds and grasses growing in your side drains is a far more uh, cost-effective method that actually, filters stuff out. So there's a
Yeah.
whole range of things of, sometimes we over-engineer when, just planting grass is not a bad option, or the right reeds or otherwise.
No, that's actually a really good point. I think what's that, bioremediation, I think they often call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the cheaper way out, and if you have the time and the space to do it.
Comment from Gopal: swamp forests along coastal roads on seaside may be good for biodiversity. Uh, I presume the answer is yes, but as long as if that's the natural sort of setup, I guess that's right. It's when we start accidentally changing the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the same as roads anywhere, and everybody likes to have a nice seaside view and access to beaches and things like that. So that's it's a common problem. But when you in these ring roads, some in the Western Pacific where I saw it, just if you start filling across, and building a causeway across these lagoons or areas where you have wetland areas, and then you cut off that saltwater, freshwater flow, is that's what does the damage, particularly the mangroves. And mangroves are in the Pacific Islands are extremely valuable from a wildlife standpoint.
And from a
And
coastal erosion point of view.
that's where a lot of the crabs come from, which are great eating too. You got to keep that habitat.
Well, it's also, for a lot of the low-lying places or the coastal ones, it's the mangroves who break up the wave action before it takes out some of the roads and the rest of it. So there is
That too, yeah,
a bit of a natural affinity there. Donald's got
right.
a question about examples. I presume that's the reference books you gave there have got plenty of those, so that would be the way to go to. So Donald, just point you back to that crossings and the biodiversity references that were in the slide deck. I do have I guess, a question. If I think about Mongolia, the not a lot of fences, in general, nomadic people, nomadic farming. Often, it's a very low rainfall country, so the little bit of water concentrates by the road. So often the best, vegetation is right on the edge of the road. So we end up with the animals wanting to come to the road because we've sort of lured them in. If we put up fencing, it changes fundamentally the whole nomadic sort of farming nature of the country. It's that whole balance. Like, where do we draw those sort of lines? You know, keep,
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I would say you should design your roadside drainage, surface drainage, so it doesn't pond right next to the road. Maybe you have more lead-off ditches that get the water away from the road, so you're not promoting vegetation to go right on the roads. Because you're right, you don't want to start putting in a lot of fences in a nomadic terrain.
no, no. And I guess if you had to pick one country that does this really well, like, is there a country or is there a state or a province somewhere where you go, this is the one that's your go-to as a good example?
Well, actually, I would say Costa Rica in the Americas is probably has some of the most progressive work on wildlife crossings, which is interesting because it's a small country, has a lot of national parks, but it has a very high road density. So because of the the tourism and the number of national parks and the value of their biodiversity and their road density, they really are driven to a lot of wildlife crossings and wildlife connectivity solutions. Plus, a nice place to hang out and visit for vacation. So that's
I was
Costa Rica.
in Auckland, where I live. They were widening the northern motorway just north of the Auckland Harbour Bridge, and there are these quite a rare bird living on a little shoal of shells there. So they spent quite a few $100,000 with helicopters building them a new nest further away so that they wouldn't be disturbed. What no one quite appreciated was that these birds liked living right beside the road, because that sort of meant that they weren't harmed by cats and dogs. So they spent all the money, but the birds came back. They were like, no, we don't want our new home. We want the old one. But anyway, that's taken us to the end of the session. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and of course, a big thank you to you, Gordon. Thanks for being our 25th presenter, and for giving up a bit of your night. And hopefully, you can get back and enjoy your new grandson. So,
yes,
and all the very best to your wife and her recovery. So, thanks everyone, and good night.
Good night.